Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be back standing with IRRPP, Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, to be introducing this program both in the room and on Zoom, and to welcome Michelle Manno. To welcome Dr. Manno back to our campus, to hear about her amazing book. It's an amazing book, Denied: Women, Sports, and the Contradictions of Identity. My name is Beth Ritchie, and I'm head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice here at UIC. I'm also a professor in Black Studies and Gender and Women's Studies, and affiliated with the Department of Sociology and former head of IRRPP. And it's all of those connections of academic work and activism work that make me so proud and so excited to be here this evening. We are going to be in for a wonderful opportunity to listen to Dr. Manno in conversation with UIC women's basketball coach, Ashleen Bracey. And I hear we're also joined by player Kristian Young. I have to say it's wonderful to be around all of these people who look like they're student athletes. Yeah? I want to give a special welcome to you. Your power, the way that you represent UIC, your athleticism, your academic work, we're really proud to have you here this evening. Welcome to the UIC Plains. I want to pause for a moment before we begin the formal program to acknowledge the violences all around us, in Chicago, in Maine, in the Middle East, in the suburbs, all around us, struggles with fear, terror, violence coming from unexpected and then some expected places. The struggles with war seem to be endless. The extent that we are experiencing and witnessing human suffering, terror, fear, attacks on innocent people, expressions of domination and control must be on our minds and in our hearts and in our activism work. I want to call your attention to the work on this campus that students are involved in organizing, and indeed the work that IRRPP has done under the leadership of Dr. Amanda Lewis and the comrades who are also here from IRRPP to challenge some of the stereotypes, some of the assumptions, some of the inequities, some of the injustices that so many of our communities, both here and around the world, are facing. Now on to this evening. Dr. Michelle Manno is Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern University, where she provides strategic support toward equity and justice, working for building an inclusive environment on that campus. Lucky for Northwestern. Prior to that, she was here at UIC, working as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity Initiatives, which is a critical role, as we know, continues to be a critical role on this campus. Dr. Manno was involved in creating the Equity Dashboard Project, leading the Advancing Racial Equity Strategic Plan, and championing the work of inclusion and equity and justice on this campus, working on things like campus climate, student mental health, food and housing insecurity, gender affirming spaces, and teaching courses in the Intergroup Dialogue program. Dr. Manno earned her PhD in sociology from Emory University, although that was like a satellite of UIC at the time. And she also earned her master's in sociology at UIC. So we're welcoming her back. Welcome back, Michelle. Your work here lives on. Your work here lives on, including in this book. Indeed, this is an exciting sociology project. She was, of course, a sociology student. It's also a unique study in racial stereotypes and contested racial identities. It's a sharp analysis of gender and how expectations of women athletes are organized around the constraining forces of heteropatriarchy, physical power and athletic talent, normative expectations of women's bodies and desires, and how capitalism is baked into collegiate athletics. And at least in my reading, Michelle, you'll tell me if this is true or not, it's also a book about policing and how policing has gone wrong. Beyond what we typically think about of arrests and surveillance and control and confinement, this is a more subtle kind of policing, as Michelle teaches us. It's a story of how institutional regulations of behavior, where people have authority, people in power have authority to organize how people present themselves, women athletes in particular. And when people break the rules off the court as players, there's consequences to pay. The threats of rule breaking, the consequences of non-normative behavior, all of these have very serious consequences. It's a different way of thinking about policing. Deny is a uniquely interdisciplinary project, as I think you'll hear about tonight. It will appeal to the sociologists here, the gender and women's studies folks here, the criminologists, the race scholars, and importantly, it will also appeal to sports fans, especially those of us who care about women and girls' participation in these competitive spaces. And I think most importantly, it's a good read. It's a good book. It's a good read. The analysis is thoughtful and sharp. It's very accessible. The insights are very compassionate. The stories almost tell themselves. The story of constraint placed on the bodies of women's athletes, especially high-profile Black, gender non-conforming athletes. Dr. Manno argues that this is a site, a place where we can understand the persistence of racism and sexism and homophobia and classism and how it shows up on the court. As scholars, athletes, parents, fans, I promise you will not attend a UIC Flames or a Chicago Sky game again and see things the same way after you've read this book. And at the end of the day, that's why we write books. Michelle, deep congratulations and gratitude for having written yours and for what your book is telling us.
Do I even need to say anything after that? Wow, okay, just setting up here. Thank you, Beth. Hi, everybody. Hi. Coach Bracey, thank you for bringing your whole team and filling half the room. It's really special for me to be back here at UIC. As Beth shared, I have a long history with this place. So to be here giving this talk is really, really special. It's not an exaggeration to say that this book was made possible by the time I spent here, both as a graduate student and more recently as an administrator. And that's especially because of the relationships that I formed with so many wonderful colleagues, many of whom are sitting in this room. So thank you. Which leads me to some thank yous that I want to share before I dive in. First, I want to thank everybody who was involved in what is tremendous work to put on an event like this, the entire IRRPP staff, especially Dina Lewis. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you to Beth Ritchie for the really wonderful introduction, to Coach Ashleen Bracey, and for Kristian Young for agreeing to be in conversation, which will really be the best part of this talk. So I'm going to try to hurry up. And a very special thank you to my mentor and friend, Amanda Lewis, without whom this book literally would not have been written, truly. And thank you all for being here, and for those of you online as well. Okay, with that, I'll get into it. I want to say a little bit about how this book came to be. My publicist actually at NYU Press asked me a while ago when the book was first coming out, when did I get the idea for the book? And I somewhat jokingly told her that I've been writing this book since I was 8 years old and I was first playing basketball, very, very badly, I should add. And in some ways I was joking, but in a lot of ways it's true. The big questions that drove me to do the research for this book are questions I've been curious about for decades. Again, both as an athlete and then as somebody who became interested in studying athletes and studying the institution of sport. I say this to say that the book for me is personal in a lot of ways, and the process of doing this research gave me a framework to understand much of what I experienced myself as an athlete and what I think many women athletes continue to experience today. So denied is the result of my time spent with a place I call MWSU. It's a mouthful, Midwest State University, which is a pseudonym for an elite Division I women's basketball program. I spent an entire season with MWSU, and the stories that I weave into the book are the stories of these athletes, coaches, and staff who trusted me with their time and their experiences. I also interviewed a number of former elite level athletes, so you'll see those stories reflected in the book as well. Denied is an exploration of how women athletes navigate race, gender, and sexuality within an institution that was not made with them in mind. It's about the many complex and contradictory ways their identities are policed. I'm most curious about the connection between individuals' micro-level everyday experiences and the larger structures that shape them. So my aim throughout the book was to show how the lived experiences of this unique group of athletes can be tied to larger structures operating within society, again, primarily related to race, gender, and sexuality. So I'm going to talk about three of the main themes. There are more than three, but I only have 20 minutes. And I'm going to share some excerpts from the book that I think are particularly interesting for me, at least, and I think illuminate some of those themes in the best way. So the first theme is that women athletes are constrained by institutional and societal demands around their gender expressions that are complex and often in contrast with one another. So I opened the first chapter in Denied with a locker room vignette that I think really truly encapsulates these contradictions. I won't read it here because it's a bit long, and also because there are many swear words, and I'm pretty sure my mom is watching this on Zoom. But for those who haven't read it yet, I'll describe it really briefly. So in this vignette, it's halftime. The team is in the locker room. The MWSU coach, who I call Coach King, spends about 15 minutes denigrating her players for their lack of toughness and for their lack of heart. She calls them pansies and proclaims that they should get skirts instead of shorts. So here's a bit of analysis I wrote about that moment that actually also has a few swear words. So I'm sorry in advance. In early 2019, actor Natasha Lyonne was featured on a panel hosted by The Cut, in which she remarked, "The female experience for me has always been, am I enough and am I too much?" Lyonne's comment encapsulates much of what occurred during those 15 minutes in the MWSU locker room. Coach King's tirade illuminates how gender operates within larger society and at the same time derives complex meaning within the institutional confines of sport as a social institution. On the one hand, pejoratives like wuss and sissy are used to signal to players that they're not being tough enough, that they're not competing hard enough. These words become stand-ins for the deeper meanings embedded within them, and thus simultaneously send another set of messages. For instance, when King calls her players wusses and pansies and compares their performance to Sissy League, she is invoking slurs typically used to disparage men who do not conform to hegemonic definitions of masculinity, men who are weak and effeminate, men who are, in short, perceived to be more like women. Indeed, the meanings behind words like wuss, pansy, and sissy closely align with character traits rooted in definitions of hegemonic femininity, including passivity and deference. Similarly, in telling her players they should get skirts instead of shorts, King is explicitly linking feminine gendered signifiers such as clothing to traits such as weakness, inferiority, and incompetence, thereby reinforcing deeply rooted beliefs in the inferiority of women and femininity. In part, this type of speech is characteristic of her coaching style. Coach King is fierce, flashy, and from what I perceived, enjoys being feared. Coaches like her often utilize humiliating comments to motivate their players. It is illuminating that in the locker room that day, and many other days after that, in the midst of being engulfed in anger, the words that King chose to use were dripping with disparagement of characteristics commonly associated with traditional femininity. She wants bitches and ballers, players who will get nasty on the court. She doesn't want a bunch of nice girls, who King presumes care about getting their hair done as much or more than they care about their athletic performance. By denigrating her players' expressions of femininity, King explicitly marks feminine character traits and behaviors as not aligning with athleticism. The The inherent assumption is that the MWSU players were performing poorly because they were performing traits characteristic of femininity. Within the context of elite level sports, there is nothing worse than acting like a girl. Another important theme, and this is related to the first, is that the ways in which the athletes were policed were racialized. And those efforts were particularly amplified in this context when it came to recruiting. So I opened chapter 2 with a vignette of what I call a crisis moment, where the MWSU players were on winter break and they were bored. So they decided to reenact a popular hip hop music video. They decided to film it and to post it online. In that video, a group of rappers, all Black and mostly men, are singing, dancing, and interacting with a group of partially clothed women, most of whom were women of color. The players were reprimanded for making the video because it put a particular kind of queerness on display, what the coaches called girl-on-girl action. And I should say the reprimand they received was they were forced to watch the video in front of the entire team and the coaches, and then take it down. So to understand what made this a crisis moment, I used Mark Anthony Neal's concept of legible and illegible Black masculinities to sort of understand particularly the coaches' reactions to the video. I'll read a little bit about that now. It is within this context of legibility that we can best understand the MWSU coaches' reactions to their players' music video parody. The players were critiqued for their legibility and illegibility. In their various roles, they embodied both legible Black femininities and masculinities. Some of them took on the role of Jezebel, while others portrayed the criminal Black man or thug as embodied by the image of the Black rapper. These representations, while fictional, presented problems for the MWSU coaches because at their most basic level, they put on display racialized stereotypes that are often accompanied by social derision and inherently require social control. The Jezebel and thug are in direct contrast to the role model girl next door image that puts parents and their young children in the MWSU stands during game time. Why the players' legibility matters is because this is all happening, as I said, in the larger context of recruiting, a context in which the team is attempting to present an image to recruits and to their families of them as heterosexual. And the players spoke at length to me about all of the kind of implicit and explicit rules around recruiting that they had to follow. They were told, for example, it was fine that they were queer, but they needed to tone it down, especially in front of recruits. They couldn't wear men's clothes or talk about their girlfriends. They couldn't take recruits to gay places or talk to them about gay things, which can be a lot of things. I'll read a little bit about that. There are several striking things worth highlighting about MWSU's recruiting rules. No men's clothes, no girlfriends, no gay things. First, they illuminate the extent to which gender and sexuality are conflated in this context, and as a result, the extent to which these rules were applied disproportionately. It is certainly true that there were players on the MWSU team who were queer and feminine presenting. These rules were not made for them. These rules were for Prince, Nikki, Kyle, and the other MWSU players who were both queer and masculine presenting. Second, such rules made clear that securing a highly sought after recruit was more valuable than creating a context in which the players already on the MWSU team could be free to truly be themselves. While the players generally talked about these recruiting rules with indifference or at worst annoyance or inconvenience, I had to wonder about the larger effects of such explicit hostility. What does it mean to be thought of as valuable only in their abilities to successfully convince others they are not, in fact, who they are? Finally, the ideological underpinnings of the phrase "tone it down" are important to unpack in order to fully grasp its power within the MWSU context. It is at once a phrase that invokes cultural narratives around gender, sexuality, and race. When the coaches tell the players to tone it down, they are asking them to obscure their sexuality, mostly as indicated through their gender expressions. It's also a phrase with deeply racialized dimensions, specifically reminiscent of stereotypical perceptions of Black girls and women as too loud or unladylike. It is a phrase that indicts a particular kind of racialized gender expression and sexuality. Indeed, the players were not told what kinds of clothes they had to wear, but they were explicitly told what not to wear. Baggy jeans, exposed boxers, Converse shoes, and a fitted cap. Seemingly simple requests to tone it down are in fact complex requirements that implore ideologies of race, gender, and sexuality in nuanced and complicated ways. The disciplinary moments embedded within toning it down are ultimately about bodily regulation. Which bodies are perceived to be capable of representing MWSU appropriately and with the greatest opportunity for securing top recruits, and which bodies, however temporarily, are disposable. The MWSU players who were queer and embodied legible forms of Black masculinity were the targets of especially harmful discipline. They were regulated from expressing their full selves, from representing the program as who they genuinely feel themselves to be. While it is clear that many of the players found these practices troublesome, they became so deeply embedded in the culture at MWSU that most of the players did not actively resist. Behind closed doors, they laughed about these rules or balked at pictures of themselves wearing skirts. But at the end of the day, they did what was expected of them. Doing so reinforced not just the toxic don't ask, don't tell culture at MWSU, but also reinforced larger structures of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. The last theme I'll talk about is related to what's often referred to as the cultural contradiction of female athleticism, or this idea that the expectations that we have for athletes don't align with the expectations that we have for women, particularly around expressing certain forms of femininity. And I'll also talk briefly about the strategies that the athletes use to navigate that contradiction. The literature doesn't talk enough about this, but the cultural contradiction of women's athleticism operates within a larger framework of beauty ideals rooted in notions of womanhood, femininity, and sexuality that are racialized. The very construction of the category woman and the ideas of beauty cannot be separated from ideologies of race. Womanhood was created to be synonymous with whiteness, and the exclusion of Black women from the category of woman has been enforced legally and embraced culturally throughout history. I admit when I first started imagining this project, I thought it was unlikely in the contemporary moment that women athletes were still having difficulty being appropriately feminine and athletic, especially because the term cultural contradiction was from the 1970s, which for some of you was a million years ago. So you might imagine my surprise when I had this exchange with MWSU athlete Rowan. The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of the drill, and the MWSU players made their way off the court for a quick water break. Some sat rehydrating and high-fiving each other over made shots and clever passes. Others refastened headbands and tightened shoelaces, shaking out their arms and legs to stay loose. I sat at the scorer's table mid-court, tallying statistics from the drill, carefully calculating how many shots Kyle took, whether Jazeel secured at least 5 rebounds, and how many steals Nikki made. As I counted the final numbers and prepared to hand the sheet to one of the coaches for review, Rowan Dawson walked over to me. Sticking her arm out in front of her, she glanced at it briefly and casually asked, "Are my arms getting smaller?" I smiled, taken aback by her question, and after looking at her arm for a second or two, said, "No, do you want them to be?" "Yeah," Rowan quickly exclaimed. "Why?" I asked, confused. Rowan replied, "I look too manly. Like when I get dressed up and wear a shirt like this, pointing to just above her bicep, it doesn't look good." I stared at Rowan quizzically and shrugged. "Isn't that the point, to be big?" I asked. "No, I gotta look sexy." The buzzer sounded again to signal the end of the water break. Coach King blew her whistle and motioned for the players to line up for the next drill. As Rowan walked away, I shouted, "You can't be both?" Rowan turned, looked back at me, and with a slight, almost pitying grin on her face, shook her head from side to side as if to say, "No." Rowan wasn't alone in these feelings. Most of the athletes, current and former, expressed similar sentiments, that they couldn't actually be all the things that they wanted and felt they needed to be at the same time. So what many of them ended up doing was engaging in strategies to help them navigate the discrepancy between their current situation and both their own and others' ideas about what they should be doing or what they should look like. These things included wearing makeup before games, making sure their tattoos were covered, making sure their hair was done in a particular way or that they had shaved. But some of the players also engaged in strategies that could have had a direct impact on their performance, like altering their training regimens so they didn't have to do as much, if any, weight training. Rowan was one of these players. It's also really important for me to note, though, that the athletes were not just engaging in these strategies at a personal level. They were also navigating the strategies of others that were being imposed upon them, like their coaches. And I'll read an example of that. It's exactly 60 minutes before the start of the game, and as expected, the MWSU players start to make their way to the stadium floor to begin their warm-up exercises. As they begin to assemble on the court, lightly jogging up to half court and back or stretching in pairs, the coaching staff gathers near the team's bench to discuss last-minute strategy and lineup changes. Rowan Dawson, MWSU star player and team captain, emerges at the top of the stadium steps, quickly and gracefully tiptoeing down, a focused but relaxed look on her face, eyes turned downward. Her hair is pulled loosely back in a low ponytail, and as she descends toward the floor, a few small wisps come loose. Unfazed, she brushes them back and continues toward the floor. Coach King looks up from her clipboard and, after a moment of watching Rowan, exclaims, "Just brush your hair." The other coaches turn to see what King is referencing. She goes on, "I'm not asking her to do anything fancy. Just brush your hair. Why would she think it's okay to come down like that? We're playing another team. She wants to be all league. Why does she think that's appropriate?" Without hesitation, assistant coach Johnny Jacobs walks over to Rowan, who has by now joined her teammates in a pregame layup drill, and pulls her to the side. After a brief moment of talking, Rowan walks off the floor toward the MWSU locker room. She comes back several minutes later. This time, her hair is slicked back tightly into her ponytail, not a single strand out of place. So I want to end by saying a little bit about why I think all of this matters, and why I think we should still be engaging meaningfully with concepts like the cultural contradiction of women's athleticism. And this is the last one, I promise. What is most important about understanding this nuance within the cultural contradiction of women's athleticism is that women athletes are thinking about this, consciously or otherwise. And every second a woman athlete thinks about whether she appears feminine enough is a second wasting limited cognitive resources that could be used to do something better. In 2020, marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson penned a powerful op-ed in the Washington Post, in which she describes the mental and emotional toll of racism on Black people and the corresponding loss of what could have been. I read a little bit of that quote. "Even at its most benign, racism is incredibly time-consuming. Consider the discoveries not made, the books not written, the ecosystems not protected, the art not created, the gardens not tended." Whenever I read this quote, I think about Rowan and about how in the middle of practice, she was thinking about whether her arms were getting too big. She might have also been thinking about sport-related things, her shooting form, how her knee was feeling, whether she made a good decision during the last drill, but she was also thinking about her arms, and likely the rest of her body too. In some ways, that is what it means to be a woman in the world, the gaze of others incessantly thrumming in the background of our lives. But in other ways, Rowan's mental meandering seems especially troubling. I'm not suggesting that Rowan should not have been thinking about anything else except basketball during basketball practice. I am suggesting, however, that of all the things she could have been thinking about, wondering whether her body still looks sexy despite her muscular arms should not have had to be one of them. Rowan Dawson was one of the best players to go through the MWSU women's basketball program. Across all players in the program's history, Dawson is ranked in the top 10 in points scored in her career, three-pointers made, and rebounds. She is quite literally one of the best players to have ever stepped foot on the court in an MWSU uniform. Yet she is not immune to the perniciousness of the woman athlete paradox and the energy required to battle it. Quite often I wonder what more Rowan, or any other woman athlete for that matter, might have accomplished Was she not hemmed in by white supremacist and heteronormative expectations of her body? Perhaps she wonders sometimes too. Thank you very much.
Time, applause for Michelle. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here and in Zoomlandia. It's my pleasure to introduce Coach Ashleen Bracey. Ashleen, yes, get flowers for everybody. Ashleen is starting her second season as the head women's basketball coach for the UIC Flames after arriving in March 2022. Ashleen had a memorable first season back home in Chicago, leading the Flames to a 19-win season, a postseason appearance, and a tie for the second most wins by a head coach in school history. Right? The Flames began the 2022-23 season going 8-1, accumulating more wins than they had over the past 3 seasons combined. Ashleen arrived at UIC after spending the past 6 seasons as an assistant coach at the University of Missouri. During her tenure at Mizzou, Bracey, or I should say Ashleen, well, Coach Bracey, let's go Coach Bracey, or Bracey, was instrumental in helping the Tigers reach 3 NCAA tournaments and make 2 WNIT appearances. After graduating from Illinois State in 2010 with a degree in criminal justice sciences, Ashleen played professional basketball in Greece for 1 year prior to transitioning to the sideline as a coach. Finally, Ashleen attended Oak Park River Forest High School, where she was a 3-time All-West Suburban Conference honoree for the Huskies. So let's get another round of applause. We also have a little bit of a surprise guest for some of you, but not for most of you. One of the UIC Flames, Kristian Young. So Kristian Young is an Indianapolis native who, before coming to UIC, led her team from Lawrence North School to a state championship, a Metropolitan Interscholastic Conference championship, and a Marion County championship in 2020. With the UIC women's basketball team, Kristian plays point. Okay. And has posted some great numbers since joining the team her freshman year. You can find those on uicflames.com. One I do want to point out is that last season, she grabbed a career high 13 rebounds in a win over Bradley. And I point that out because often we tall folks don't really like it when the shorter folks are in the paint. But congratulations anyway. Kristian is also majoring in integrated health studies at UIC. So another round of applause. So I am excited to be in conversation with these amazing people for a number of reasons. IRRPP decided to host this launch because Michelle is amazing, also a longtime supporter of IRRPP, a former student at UIC, and also is well beloved by many folks on campus after being at UIC, working in UIC's Office of Diversity for some years. The other reason is all of us have played Division I basketball. And what's interesting is that we're kind of sitting in a spectrum here. So Kristian, you're currently playing. You probably love the sport still. Coach has played and is coaching and probably still loves the sport. Michelle not playing, but maybe does pickup games. I don't know. Okay, that's fine. But loves the sport and follows WNBA, college basketball, right? Okay. And then there's me, who's still working through some trauma. But after having conversations, and reading this book, I'm like, that's what it is. Oh, okay. Great. All right. This is wonderful. I can work through this and I can start to love the game again. But I want to first talk about motivations for why we do the things that we do, especially when they are hard. It's to kind of set the stage and to get folks to know our panelists a little better. It's So I'm going to start with you, and you already kind of started with this by talking about why you wrote this book and did this research. But I want to ask why in this way. So you said when you were 8, it was in your blood that you wanted to like be all about basketball forever. But why ethnographic research, which is notoriously difficult, as most PhD programs are, but specifically doing ethnographic research, especially on a topic that you are intimately familiar with, having played basketball. So there's probably some real rough times and some real great times, so why this?
Yeah.
Is it on?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I made the joke. It wasn't really 8. I wasn't doing much at 8. I wasn't doing much for a long time. So I'll say a couple of things, but it is true that particularly when I was in college, started a little bit in high school, but mostly once I went to college, I was an athlete who loved the weight room. I loved it. I would try to get my teammates to do like dip competitions with me, which was and I observed, I was sort of observing other of my teammates sort of going through a lot of the things I talk about. And then I started to notice I was sort of doing those same sorts of things. And so it became curious to me just in this sort of subconscious way, I think. And so then when I eventually came to graduate school and I started to think about what kind of research do I want to do, it felt in some ways like I had been sort of preparing to ask these questions. Why ethnographic research in particular? I think that there's something really interesting about, again, like I said, really trying to see how these theories, these sociological theories that we're reading about, how are they actually playing out in real life? Like, what does that actually look like? I also think with a lot of these things I'm talking about, some of these decisions the athletes are making, these are not conscious decisions. And so to just do an interview, for example, where you say, oh, tell me about all the gender strategies you do, and people are like, what are you talking about? And in fact, even when I was talking to the players after the fact, and I was like, yeah, I noticed that you did this. Can you tell me a little bit about why? And they'd be like, I don't know. That's just what I do. And so the ethnographic part of it was really so that I could observe how some of these things were playing out beyond just asking people about them. I should also add that my mentor, Amanda, is a famous sociologist who, mentored me to do qualitative research in that way. And so that was a big part of also why I was curious about it. And I would add, the literature that's out there on women athletes is pretty sparse in general, and there was really none of it that did an ethnographic picture. And so it was important for me to also contribute in that way. So I think these stories are worth knowing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Coach Bracey, you've been around basketball for your whole life. And I know some of your family members have also been around basketball and are still in basketball. What is your motivation to still be about that basketball life, especially as a coach?
A great question. Actually, you alluded to it when you were asking these questions, just about sort of the trauma that you have been through, that you're still working through trauma. And, I just feel that there's so many people that have been through traumatic college experiences, especially student athletes. And I became very aware of these through I had a great experience personally. But I became aware of sort of other people's traumatic experiences during my time playing, and then especially when I played overseas. And I had a great mentor myself that just made the experience special for me and empowered me, and honestly changed my life. And once I kind of figured out that it wasn't like that for everybody, and everybody didn't have that opportunity that I had, I just became passionate about like paying it forward and giving, or being a part of, creating that experience for student athletes so that they could leave saying that they love their experience, that they grew from their experience, and not leave saying that they're still working through trauma. Now, I understand that there's only so much of that I can control. And sometimes that's hard, but just in my mind, I want to do everything in my power to create a safe space, help them be successful, and win some championships along the way.
Thank you for that. Kristian, so the three of us really know well how difficult it is to be a student athlete, especially in college at a D1 school. So what motivated you to continue your athletic career at this level while also learning and studying at, the collegiate at a different level?
For me, I've been motivated because I've been around coaches like Coach Bracey who empower us to believe that through basketball we can reach levels that we've never reached before. And also that we have a community behind us, like my teammates, they're all here supporting me and my coach today. The familial aspect that this team provides is something that I don't think I would be able to get if I was just a regular student here at USC.
Thank you for that. Thank you to the team who's also here and other coaches who are here too. So, okay, back to you, Michelle. In the book, you're tackling big themes. You just outlined some. I'm also going to say some: heterosexism, patriarchy, anti-Blackness, more. How do we see these themes from the book playing out in not just popular culture, but specifically like sports pop culture now? And I'm also going to ask Ashleen, and also feel free to jump in too, Kristian.
So, lucky for me, because it took me so long to write this book, in some ways, is that there was always some element of pop culture and sports that overlap, that was sort of popping up, that I was like, this is the book, kind of all over the place. I'll just say too, because I think there are others, these are the two folks I talk most about in the book, and that's of course Serena Williams and Brittany Griner. And I think those are the kind of classic examples, if you will, of how all of these big systems of oppression, like you're talking about, kind of converge in one and really shape the experiences of those two athletes in particular. Moya Bailey introduced a term called misogynoir, which is the kind of unique experience that Black women face, the combination of racism and misogyny. And I think that really speaks to Serena Williams' experience. And I think you add to that for Brittany Griner experiences what it means to be queer, to be more masculine presenting, and altogether kind of different experience. And so I talk a lot about those two, because I think that really, it's just so much again and again of the themes from the book. But there are others. We were just talking about, I don't know, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in. One that particularly comes to mind for me was last, would have been April, during the national championship game, when Angel Reese, an LSU women's basketball player, and Caitlin Clark, an Iowa women's basketball player, sort of, I guess, were showing, in my opinion, passion for the stage and the situation that they had worked so hard to be a part of. And it just kind of blew up in a really negative way. And I think first it blew up because we're women and we're not supposed to be in those scenarios. That's unladylike or showing too much passion. You had referred to it as like this constant state of, am I enough or am I too much, right? But I think secondly, and where it really hit for me, and I think probably, I think a lot of my players can probably relate to this, is just the fact that Angel Reese really carried the negative side of it. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's kind of where that racial piece comes in, and sort of how, sometimes Black women are just a little bit more under the microscope and are seen as more aggressive or expected to act, a certain way. So that would be the one that really comes to mind for me.
Kristian, you want to share your thoughts?
I agree with what she said. There are so many microaggressions and discriminations placed on us as women because we were supposed to be in this feminine light while doing a sport that is quote unquote masculine. Mm-hmm. So when we're cussing or just showing passion, there are these things in our head that are going on to water ourselves down so we don't get technical fouls and put our team in situations where we give the other team an opportunity to score 2 points and get the ball back in critical moments of excitement, in that case, on the stage of the championship game. So
thank you for sharing that. Just a quick side note. So are you allowed to swear on the court? Because I just want to tell you, if we swore on the court, whether it was practice or a game, we had to run lines for every single letter Every letter. No. So if we said MFing all the way out B, we're done. I mean, that was practice.
Fortunately, when we do use cuss words, we do not have to run because it is a way of self-expression.
Yeah.
And it's normally we're doing it through passion and competitiveness and not because we're upset or angry at the next person. So
What a beautiful response. Thank you for that. So Coach, I'm going to ask you about some of the contradictions and tensions that Michelle brought up in her book. So the idea of being athletic, so strong, fast, aggressive, and then also how specifically women's players have to also meet the expectations around stereotypes of gender and sexuality. So being appropriately feminine, not being muscular, not taking up too much space. So in what ways do you recognize your players navigating those contradictions? And I'm not putting you on the spot saying that you're forcing them, but just seeing it as they're just navigating life.
Well, I guess, is it okay if I just speak to some of the contradictions that I see?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that the one that pops up a lot would be just the young ladies, they want to be great. You know, they want to be, each of them, you know, they want to be the best that they can be. And compete at a high level on the court. And they put in a ton of work to do that. But there's definitely, you know, a piece of this that they kind of don't want to go all in the weight room to be as strong, fast, and explosive as they maybe need to be there because of the body image piece and how they'll be perceived by other people or called manly or masculine or, you know, whatever it may be. And so to me, that's a tough one. And it's a tough one for coaches to navigate because ultimately it's our job to help them be their very best. And
Yeah.
I mean, I know that you love the weight room, but that's a really important piece to being successful.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And Kristian, I would love for you to jump in too. And I'm not necessarily, you know, thinking coach to coach or player to player, these contradictions and tensions, or coach to player, if I didn't say that, or coach to coach. But you can respond to the question about these contradictions, but also thinking about fans, like how do fans participate in holding you as a player and your teammates to gender and sexuality norms or stereotypes?
something that I became aware of my freshman and sophomore year was tattoos. So I was on a team with players who had a lot of tattoos, and our coaches made us wear long leggings and long sleeve shirts because she didn't want us to come off as aggressive or to offend the fans and other people because we were looking like thugs. So we all had to wear it to look uniform, yet those people were still feminine in their own way. They just had art on their body.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And Michelle, I want to kind of bring this also back to you because this is not just about gender and sexuality, it's also about race. Can you talk more about how these contradictions are exacerbated by race?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Kristian just shared is a perfect example. We would never use the term thug to describe white athletes. We just don't do it. And there are particular ways in which the kinds of gender expressions, bodily presentations that were getting policed, at least for the team I was with, that was reserved for the players who, I mean, most of the players were Black, but for the queer players, for the players who were more masculine presenting, right, they were experiencing the most strict forms of policing. And it was exactly because of that, right? The attempt to create a particular kind of image that's rooted in these sort of foundations and whiteness, right? And white femininity in particular. And so when you have things like tattoos, right? Tattoos are something that, you know, they take on different meanings depending on the body that they're on. And so, yeah, all of this I think is deeply connected to race as it is as much about gender and sexuality as well.
Yeah. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the femininity piece. And we talked about this when we were prepping for the event that, you know, folks are wearing makeup. in, it's not just basketball, it's in a lot of women's sports. I mentioned how WNBA players are being filmed before games in their fits. Fits means outfits for people who are not as fit as me. I'll let you know. And we all know the fashion industry is really feminized. So when you write about these different types of performances of femininity, and you make sure to say the problem is not that people do this, not that people wear certain things or are wearing makeup or bows, but that they're forced to perform a certain femininity. So can you talk and like kind of complicate, the idea of like wearing makeup or doing your hair in a particular way, both as a gender strategy that can reinforce these inequities or norms, and also could also be a practice of empowerment?
Yeah, I appreciate this question, and it's always hard because I think one of the things that you could take away from this book is that I'm being critical of when athletes are doing these things. And so I think it's important for me to name that it's actually not these practices of these gender strategies like wearing makeup, shaving, right, making sure your hair is in a particular way. There's nothing wrong with those. I think for me, what I'm trying to do is have us question what are the conditions in which athletes feel as though they have to do those things in order to be perceived in a particular way. Because you're right, those types of practices, whatever they might be, can be and are empowering, right? To be able to make choices around how I want to show up in a space is an empowering practice. And I think particularly in these big structures of oppression that we often don't feel like we can do much about, those small practices can make a big difference. And I'm also always thinking about, but what does it mean, right? How are we then reinforcing some of these structures inadvertently, right? So it is a tension, but yeah, I used to talk about, I say this in the book, when I was teaching a sports class and I would talk about this, I would always have people say, well, what's wrong with bows? And I'd be like, nothing. Nothing. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with makeup. There's even nothing wrong with, I think, some of the other more, I would say, consequential strategies like modifying weight training, right? If that's what somebody wants to do, I think we could talk about, again, where that might become problematic. But for me, it's just, do you have the agency to make choices that are truly out of empowerment? Or is there a piece, however subconscious, that you feel like I kind of have to do this if I want people to perceive me in a particular way? And that's the question I want us to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to open it up to Coach and Kristian if you want to jump in and you have thoughts about that.
You made a point earlier that just like really hit me. I'm constantly talking to my players about just mental clarity, and that it's my number one job to just kind of stay out of their minds, let them think for themselves, and just help them just play the game free. But it's really interesting and educating to hear and to listen to some of the things that you're saying, because it's helping me understand why sometimes it's so difficult for them to play with this clarity, because they're constantly battling so many, they're confused. You know what I mean? There's so many contradictions out there, that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And so I just think this is awesome. I want to keep talking about it, but this is awesome. I think I'm watching their faces as we're talking, and they're like so engaged in this conversation, because I think they're finding themselves in a lot of what we're talking about, which I think is cool. But particularly speaking on the femininity piece, there's a young lady, there's an assistant coach at Texas A&M University, wonderful woman, and she loves to wear high heels. She has fits, okay. Yes. Hair is always great, like makeup, lashes, all the above. And it just brings me back to the either am I too much or am I not enough deal, because she's just expressing herself, right? And she obviously loves the way that she expresses herself. She posts herself on social media, all the above, but the comments that this woman has to just stroll through on a daily, do you guys know what I'm talking about? On a gamely basis, just regarding how feminine she's trying to be. And she's doing too much, or her heels are too high, or her outfits are inappropriate, And it's constant clutter. And so I'm very intrigued on what we can do and the solutions we can find to start trying to clear this clutter so we can be our best selves.
That's beautiful. Clutter. Kristian, do you want to say anything?
I agree with what they both said. Like, we're trying to uphold femininity while also maintaining standards that were placed on us by people we don't even know. So I think that it is great for people like our coaches, mentors, people above us to empower us and to remind us that our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measures.
Marketing folks, can you get a picture, please? Can
I add a thing that just made me think of?
No.
Yeah, really, why would I? No, but I think there's a piece here, and I didn't talk so much about this, but I think it's worth talking about that. Not all of the athletes in my book wanted to be feminine either. So that's, I think, another point, especially for those of us who are queer, for maybe playing with gender in different ways. Like, we're not actually trying to do that. And that matters. But yet, there's still judgments and there's still expectations. So you could even be pulling yourself outside of that space altogether, and people are still going to try to loop you back in, right? So if you're trying to be non-binary, there's going to be a particular way you need to be non-binary, right? In order to, again, align with people's expectations. So I think that's also, I see more of that. I mean, I think the WNBA is a fantastic example of some of this now. We're seeing, players are presenting in all kinds of ways. And that's really cool. And yet these big structures are still sort of hemming them in some ways too. So just wanted.
Thank you for that. That's it's a great segue into my next question. But I also want to point out that, you mentioned social media, and I think social media is, there's so many different sides to it. It's so difficult, but it can also be really affirming, because that coach, is getting all of these comments on social media, different platforms, and then Black women are coming to defend her, which is beautiful. Moya Bailey, talks about misogynoir, but the other thing is that coach is getting out there, which means women's basketball is getting out there, and people are getting more intrigued, and they're like, oh, this is something different. And also garnering all of that support for, she gets to do what she wants. She can be as big as she wants, she can be as small as she wants, she gets to be her. So I can also appreciate social media a little bit. And speaking of, kind of like in terms of changes, so comparing when you did the research, not necessarily the book, but when you did the research, what kinds of things are you seeing change in women's sports? You just mentioned WNBA, but also you think about other sports. So talk a little bit about the areas of hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of change. The WNBA is, I think, a great example. Way back when, for those who don't know, when the WNBA was first starting, there were things like when you had new players coming in their first years, they were getting sent through makeup classes. They were getting sent through classes on how to dress feminine, right? And now I think the WNBA has a partnership with Tomboy X, right? So there's this way in which the league has really shifted. It used to be, I think, this kind of like very sort of attempting to do a particular kind of family-friendly atmosphere, which was really just coded for, straight white families, and now has really moved to, I think, embracing much more of its internal diversity and supporting its queer players, supporting its non-binary players. I don't know. I was trying. There's no list of like how many queer players are in the WNBA, but if you look at just the.
But you tried to count it.
But I tried to find. But for those who follow, the championship just happened, and the New York Liberty, I think, is a great example. So if they're like, top 4 players, 3 of those players are out, and that's huge. That's just a huge shift. So I think that's one. I think also we've seen a lot of activism in sports, right, writ large, not just in basketball, but I think the WNBA is another good example. They were doing Black Lives Matter related activism long before Colin Kaepernick was doing it. Didn't get the recognition for it. But I think all these things matter, right? Because there are these big ways that change is happening. And then there are other ways, like a lot of the things I talk about in the book that the coaches do in particular. We are moving away from, I think, a sporting context, and I would love to actually for y'all to talk about this. I think we're moving away by and large from those things being okay. The sort of taken for granted ways in which coaches are interacting with their players, and perhaps where some of your trauma comes from, where some of my trauma around sports comes from. That sort of treatment, or what we could frankly call abuse, we're not seeing, at least I think, as much of in sports, because people are more willing to say this isn't right. And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah. And when we were prepping, going back to like the different classes, we had to, on my team, we had to take a sex ed class. I guess it was sex ed. But it was very focused on heterosexual sex, very cisgender sex. I mean, we were sitting in this room and, you know, you've maybe seen these in movies, but like pulling out bananas and like putting condoms on them. And we're like, oh my God, this is so awkward. It's terrible. And that was the class, because the idea was you don't want to get pregnant. And okay, fine, but that's not the only type of sex that people were having or wanted to have. And also there is like, sex isn't all bad, right? But that's what the message we were getting, and that we would be bad. So hopefully those classes are not happening. But who knows? Anyway.
That's a whole other book.
Yeah, that's a second book. A different type of denied. Canceled for that. Oh, Dina used to work at USC. Coach, so thinking about when you were here and now, what kinds of things are you seeing change? Where is the hope?
There's definitely a lot of hope. I think in representation, you know, I think, and I don't know the stat, my boss, Michael Lippitz, is he just walked in, this is the athletic director. He hired me 18 months ago, but he might know, post-COVID, 2021 or 2022, the most Black female head coaches were hired in colleges. And I don't know the percentage of the hires, but it was pretty high. So I think, and I say Black females, but just females in general coaching women's basketball. I mean, there's 0 female head coaches in the NBA. Mm-hmm. Yet, you know, and again, I have my brother is a, you know, women's basketball coach. So nothing, you know, against males that coach the sport, but I do think representation and kind of have walked the walk and experienced it yourself, and then being able to lead young ladies and be better, because ultimately, you know, as humans, we want to be better and grow. So I think that has gotten a lot better and has affected things. I think you alluded to just like people being able to be out. When I was in college, that just wasn't a thing. It was hidden. It wasn't accepted. You know, it was kind of like what you alluded to in your book, to where it was like, you can be gay, but just don't be out about it, or, you know, don't be obvious, those types of things. And I was lucky enough to accept this opportunity to head coach with my fiance on my arm, and she's actually in the audience right now. Say hi to everybody. You know, and Michael Lippitz didn't bat an eye, you know what I mean? And it's accepted, and she's welcomed into our family and around. And so I think that's a big way that we've seen growth as well. Kristian, you got anything? I mean, there's been so many ways. I mean, we just Iowa women's basketball and DePaul women's basketball just competed at Iowa and had 55,000 fans there, like the most attended women's basketball game in history. So like our sport is out there. We're getting more respect. We're getting you know, more fans, and so I think there's been immense growth. But I think there's a lot of things still left to tackle, and it sounds like from your research, particularly from a mental standpoint.
Well, we're coming right back to you. So Kristian, so thinking about your experiences as a student athlete and maybe experiences of other folks, friends that you have at other schools who might be student athletes, what are some ways that you think we can create safe spaces for women athletes? So not just coaches, but allies, like other people, staff, faculty.
I think the biggest way to support women athletes is just to empower us and teach us like our bodies are beautiful, no matter if we're skinny, big, strong, lazy. Also that our emotions do not make us weak.
Right.
Our emotions make us strong and powerful because we're taught to like keep it to a minimum, but really we should put our emotions on the floor because we put our livelihoods into this game, practicing every day. And I think we should be able to express ourselves and be able to be supported by those around us.
Invite you to every panel that we do. So you can just be here on the end, just like with these singers. It's great. So Coach, you kind of talked about this, and Michelle, I'd love to hear from you. So what are some things that coaches and sports administrators can do to create truly inclusive environments for women athletes?
Well, first, I would like to note and say that I've been at 3 or 4 different universities in my coaching career, played at 1, so 5 total. And this is by far the most inclusive university that I've ever coached at. And it is like such a breath of fresh air. I'm experiencing things that just I've never thought about experiencing, and it's awesome. And just the way that the diversity, like the inclusion, the education, like all of it is just amazing and super cool to be a part of. But you know, for me, I can only speak really for myself. And my thing is I need to show up as myself. You know, and I think that's, to be honest, what we were denied as student athletes, is I don't think our head coaches always felt like they were allowed to show up as themselves, you know, and I spoke to that about my fiance, but, you know, I have, I'm several players that, you know, identify as not heterosexual or whatever they may identify as, and me being able to represent myself as what I am shows them that it's okay. And it makes them feel comfortable to bring their significant others around, and be themselves. And, you know, I played in the time period where you couldn't get tattoos. Yeah. You know, you couldn't wear your hair a certain way, you know, those things, but I don't put that on them. You know what I mean? I allow them to be who they are. You know, Kristian, you know, let you know today that's okay to swear on my court. I mean, I'm gonna look at you funny and just be like, hey, let's be respectful, but like they're not gonna be punished because of it. I mean, ultimately they're competing. Their blood, sweat, and tears are going into everything that they're doing. And it's okay for them to feel comfortable to be themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just what it is. I think if more head coaches can show up, be themselves, show their players who they are, and allow their players to be who they are, I think we create a safe space.
Can I come back? Can I play for you, Coach? I really can't add anything to that. I will just say though, I think modeling is probably the most important thing. I think to be able to show up as you are and to model that for players is so powerful. And I think to see what it sounds like is to see your players as full human beings, right? Lots of different identities, lots of experiences, lots of ways they're trying to navigate the world, and to make space for that and to not just care about them as athletes, I think is really important. And I'll just say, I think, you know, Coach King, the King I talk about in this book, I think one of the most heartbreaking things for me is I was with this team is that she was gay. And she had a partner who everybody thought was her friend.
Yeah.
And this wasn't that long. So, you know, and I remember sort of being like, what is it? So she was closeting herself, and her players were seeing that, right? So they were seeing this coach, and I know it was tremendously painful.
I don't think she would have ever said that, but I could kind of see that and see that in her partner as well. And so that wasn't, that was modeling that her players were seeing, right? So my coach is hiding herself. My coach is, going through all of this. And so then implicitly and explicitly, right, they were being told those same messages. So the fact that, you're here and you're giving a complete opposite message. I mean, I can't imagine a more amazing space to be in as an athlete.
Thank you all so much. Before I let you step down, I would love to open it up to the audience online or in here. Any questions, comments? I take compliments. I love them. So you can go ahead with that. Person in the front.
I know I always have questions. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I'm just so happy to be listening and talking and learning from all of you. I want to ask you a question that's a little bit of a stretch maybe, but I want to, as people I think who probably are observing the world and paying attention to sports in lots of different ways, listening to you talk about hope and what's going on with women's sports. I was thinking about a lot of stories in the news recently about men's sports and the college level, maybe even some institutions nearby that, we'll let Michelle talk about that. But I'm wondering, in some ways I was listening to you thinking it feels like there's been more progress in women's sports. I mean, I played sports just for a minute in college, and there were so many women I knew who just were having eating disorders because somebody had told them they did. There was so much stuff around that. And I'm wondering do you think, just listening to you, it seems like the kind of toxic masculinity in men's sports is still so pervasive, but maybe I'm missing progress, just wondering what you think.
Okay. I'm not going to address that first part that you were asking me to address. Okay, I'm thinking of so many things in response to that. I think first of all, yes. I think, sport as an institution was created for men by men. It is steeped in toxic masculinity, and we see that in all kinds of ways. And so when we have things like hazing or all of that, that's toxic masculinity. I think also there's this way in which, because of that, so we certainly have less male athletes who are out, right? That's still a tremendous deal when that happens. And I think that's less true in women's sports. I think there's this way in which women have had a little bit more room to play with gender within sports, for example, to be out, right? Those types of things. Of course, there's all the downsides too, right? But I do think that matters. There was something else I was going to address that totally slipped my mind. You said it's the second half. What do you say? You don't even remember. Yeah. Progress. Yeah. I'll think of it. Yeah.
I want to touch on the sexuality piece. I feel like men aren't allowed to be openly gay or openly whatever they feel, but also at the same time, women are almost expected to be gay if they play basketball. So I even have family members just oh, are you gonna be gay next? I'm like, what does my sport have to do with my sexuality? So.
I'm so glad you said that, because I didn't talk about this. This was a whole other theme of the book. So if that's a curious thing for you, there's an entire chapter on it. When I asked the athletes in this book, and I said, do you think there are stereotypes about women athletes? They said, yes. And I said, what do you think they are? And they said, if you play basketball, you're gay. That was it. Full stop. Every single one of them. So I think that's part of it too. Yeah. No compliments? No, I'm just kidding. Okay,
Great job so far, guys. Okay, so let's just say we do live in a world where things are better for our sport. Do you all think that we'll still be in a situation where women feel almost like imposter syndrome, especially women of color?
Sorry, I'm just thinking about how we're doing good so far, and I really got that question. So I think with change, it's always tricky, right? Kind of we look at change historically over time. We make a lot of progress, and then we might come back a few steps, then we make progress and come back. I like to be hopeful when it comes to, we have seen quite a bit of change. I still think that, we're going to be contending with some of these big structures always, right? That's change that has to happen at this kind of big society level. That doesn't mean that the change that's happening at these smaller levels, so within a particular team, that's incredible and that matters. And I think there might always be some sort of variation of constraints, frankly. But do you all want to speak to that in any way?
So to clarify your question, like with the progress, will we always feel like we don't belong? It's tough to answer, but I know that sometimes I still feel like I don't belong. So to this point, but I think for me, it's like, it's equipping myself with the knowledge and educating myself to know that I do. And to know that, these were societal constraints that were placed here that, I was not in mind when they were, you know what I mean? And so I think with that knowledge and understanding, I think that you can kind of circumvent that feeling and get yourself back to a good mental space to work and remind yourself that you do. And I think also like, that's why I'm so passionate about what I do, because these ladies will not leave this program without being prepared to handle those same moments and to sort of recenter their minds to understand that they do belong. And I'm very passionate about that piece.
To your point of like not belonging, I think that people think they don't belong until they do. So when one person breaks through, when one woman does it, I feel like that will pave the way for many other women to follow in their footsteps. Like the first lady to coach in the NFL. Now you have more women realizing I know football just as much as a male does. So I'm more than equipped to walk into this room, take this interview, and become a part of the staff as well.
Last question.
Hey, this is so great. I'm wondering, you haven't talked very much about sort of popular culture and how it treats women's sports in general and women's basketball. So I'd like one of you to maybe make a pitch for a TV show or movie, a YA novel that you'd like to see.
Nadine, you're giving me so many ideas for what's next in my career.
Yeah.
A YA basketball novel. Is that? I don't know. I mean, I think so. There's a whole probably another hour of conversation we could have about representation and the media, and I think that there are in some ways where that's done really well, and in some ways where it's done really poorly. And so, I mean, I just go back to something Ashleen was saying at the beginning, which is just like the more representation we can have, the better. So if we had anything out there, right, we'll take it. It might be bad at first, right? I'm thinking of like the L word, right, and the real L word, and all the iterations of that, right? Like it's not good, but it matters, right? And we watch it because we're like, we have to watch it. And so I feel that kind of would be true with something like this too, right? And the more that's out there, I mean, it's just like the popularity of women's sports growing in general, right? If we had more popular culture, media out there, then I think whatever it is, it would be better. I don't know. No press is bad. No press is bad press. Yeah.
Okay, so you'll pick one more question from Maria.
The question I always ask dissertation defensive. No, but you guys get to respond to it. So the question I always ask is, in doing this work, I know you went in with some expectations, given your history and experience in the setting that you studied. What was the biggest surprise to you that you learned and experienced, in the actual research? What thing surprised you the most? And then the other two you can say.
Well, I think the biggest surprise is, I'm half kidding with this, is the amount of laundry that women athletes can produce in the course of one practice. So I talk about this at the very end of the book. That was part of my job with the team, as I did the laundry. So I was continually shocked by how much there was and how long it took to do. No, I think for me, and this is, we've been talking about change and hope. I think for me, the biggest surprise was how unsurprising some of these things I was finding were, and how much they mirrored my own experience, because I truly did go in thinking, I was an athlete 1,000 years ago. None of what I experienced is going to be true. And it still was. And so the kind of enduring nature of some of this really was shocking to me. And I didn't talk as much about this here, but I do try to talk about it in the book, is also like the resilience and the agency also. So, the athletes are not just like passive people letting all this happen to them, right? They're finding ways to push back, to resist. So, the coaches might say a thing, and then the coaches leave the room and they'd be like, we're not doing that shit. And so those small ways that they would find to, so I think it was both a little surprising to me, because, in these contexts, right, coaches are be all end all. But they were finding their ways to navigate around and to still show up as much of themselves as they could in those spaces too. So that was surprising in a good way.
I have a follow-up question for surprises. What was the biggest surprise for you becoming a head coach? And what were you like, oh my God, I didn't know this? And then what's the biggest surprise for you becoming a collegiate student athlete?
Something that surprised me was the mental health aspect of being a student athlete. Growing up, a lot of us just dream to become a student athlete, but we don't realize until we get here, like, our mental health might be damaged, and we have to find ways to build ourselves up within our community. So that surprised me, but luckily at UIC, we have so many resources, so many people to help us through our mental health and just talk to us and allow us to be ourselves.
Can I start with my biggest surprise in going through this process with you all and preparing for this? For sure. I think my biggest surprise was figuring out how important these types of things are to, one, attend, which is why these young ladies are all here. But just even, in preparing for this, in our conversations that we're having, like, it has helped me take another step forward into being a better coach, because I've felt everything that we've talked about and I've experienced it firsthand, but I didn't always understand what it was that I was feeling and how it was affecting me. And so it's just encouraging me to educate myself more so that I can be better. And even though I'm, I think I create a safe space for my players and I show up as myself, there's still things that have been passed down from my mentors or from people, that I learned, the game of basketball from, that I may carry, over, like subconsciously. And so it's just being educated on it, talking about these things, them being here, us having this conversation has just made me that much better. So I didn't know when I agreed to do this with you that I was going to grow from it, but I feel like I've learned so much. So I appreciate you.
for that. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is, I'm not just some random traumatized former D1 player sitting here, although I am. My name is Dina Lewis. I'm one of the associate directors at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. And when we were putting this together, I was like, who's going to be up there? And Amanda was like, you should talk with, and this is her voice too, you should talk with Michelle. And I was like, nah, I'm boring, you know. And I was like, oh my God, I know someone who knows Coach Bracey. We're going to get. And when you emailed me back, I was like, this was a huge get. I am winning everything. I'm getting the best raise. Do we do bonuses? I don't know. Pay my rent. This is great. So I am so happy to be here. I'm so excited to have met you and that you came up here, and I'm so happy for you. Can we give everybody a round of applause? And so a reminder for everyone that UIC Athletics, Coach Bracey and her team are giving us tickets to their exhibition game on October 30th at 7 p.m. Central. Please look out for an email from me with the QR code or link to register to get your tickets. They'll be emailed to you. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Yeah.